And today we're going to be talking to Jack Shirley about different things. Jack is, in addition to being clearly a very respectable looking young man, is also a hit maker, a Les Paul lover, a vegan glacier, which is a French term for ice cream maker, if you don't know. And I think we have a lot to learn from him. So I'm going to turn it over to you, Jack, to introduce yourself a little bit, and maybe just tell us, just really briefly, you know, about who you are and what you do, and then we'll get into the real stuff.
Sure. Hi, I'm Jack Shirley. I popped up gigantic on my screen as soon as I started talking. Anyway, thanks everybody for joining. I'm a recording engineer in Oakland, California. I've been doing this for about 17 years. I was a musician before that, and that kind of got me into this. I own my own recording studio. It's called the Atomic Garden. Yeah, and I don't know, lately I've been more of an engineer than a musician, so that might end up being more the focus, I suppose. But yeah, I'm happy to interact.
Okay, so I'm not going to throw you any softballs here, Jack. We'll start with this question, okay?
Okay.
What is music?
Is this a real question?
It's a real question. I'm waiting.
Okay. I making sure. I don't know. Music is people's way of communicating with each other. It's a way of like celebrating things, or it's a way of it's a form of therapy. It's a form of historical documentation. It's a form of like release and all. You know, it's everything. How's that for an off-the-cuff answer?
Yeah, perfect. So, what is recording in that case, and why do it at all? You know, what's the relationship between what you described and recording?
It's making the record, a recording, a historical documentation of sorts. It's a capture of feelings and sentiments and all of it. You know, it's a way of capturing someone's art. You know, the same way that you would, you know, make a film, be it documentary film or a dramatic, you know, whatever it might be. So it's the way of preserving somebody's art, somebody's intention, you know, all of it.
And so what's your first kind of memory of recording? You know, I kind of remember, you know, you start to play music, and especially when you're a young kid, you don't really realize that the stuff you're listening to was sort of somebody had to record it, you know, especially as a young kid, you listen to, you know, the Beatles or whatever, and you know, it just seems like this thing that just appeared out of nowhere. You know, you have no idea, like, all of the time and money that went into it. So what's your kind of first memory of kind of realizing that, oh, somebody recorded this, and what drew you to that?
Ooh, I mean, my earliest memories of recording would be just trying to pull off some like real guerrilla, you know, techniques out of pure necessity. You know, I don't even know if, like, when I was early enough that, you know, when you're first listening to music and taking it all in, and like, you know, in your early whatever, I was probably like 13, you know, when I really started caring more about music. Maybe 12, 13, I guess. But like the recording side of it, I don't know if that entered in as a listener early on. When it became something that I needed, you know, as a means to capture what I was doing, then I became more interested. Less in production and more just in the act of like the capture, you know. But yeah, but my earliest memory would be making my first like demo, which would have been early high school. And stringing together a whole bunch of like, I don't even know, like consumer equipment basically to figure out how to like record a band live.
You mean like onto like a cassette tape, or how are you doing it?
Yeah, onto a stereo, like using a home stereo and stringing together a couple of like PA heads that we had because we had a little band room and stuff. And realizing like, oh, that aux in on the back of this home stereo, like if we string these things together and we just play, like we're having practice, we can essentially multi-track, do a live to 2-track recording with like all these individually mic'd things onto the, and we'd have like, you wouldn't even need to like mix it or master it. It's on the cassette, like you like it turns out that live to 2-track is like a super heavy duty, like heavy hitter, like big boy technique. I mean, if you're like good, but that's what we did out of pure necessity, because it was just like, well, I have this, I didn't even have a 4-track, you know what I mean? We just had like literally a home stereo and like a little mixer, and it's a fun process to get to learn, because you have to kind of mix before you record, which is not easy.
And how did that recording turn out?
I got to go look it up. I got to see if I can dig it up. I mean, actually, when you really boil it down, we did it in my parents' old house, the house that I grew up in, which had a hallway with a few bedrooms and a bathroom all off the same little hallway. And so we put the drums into one room, we put like cabinets into other couple of rooms, and we all stood in the hallway. So we had a full isolation of all these instruments with their own, dedicated mics and all that stuff. And figured enough out to like pan certain things on the mixer and all that stuff. So like it actually, I think it probably sounded okay. I mean, for a bunch of kids who had no idea what they were doing.
It does sound like you had a little bit of an idea of what you were doing. How did you know to isolate the instruments from one another?
You know what? I have no idea. I would have been 15 at this point, 15 or 16, probably 16. And so I have no idea. I mean, I think it just, which is funny because I do that less now than I did then. But maybe movies or something,
Mm-hmm.
But I had zero experience recording before that.
Well, yeah, I think everyone would love to hear kind of about your trajectory kind of from that. I know for a while, then you kind of graduated to having actually a home studio at your parents' house, and then eventually kind of actually moved into, a dedicated studio space, and then on to where you are now. So tell us a little bit about kind of the different steps in that trajectory. And I think what a lot of people would love to hear is sort of, some of those steps were big steps to take, this last one definitely really big and a grown-up thing. But what did that sound like in your head when you were like, I'm going to do this for real, as far as like, for example, from your parents' house to the next thing? But I want to hear about the whole path, if you like.
Sure. I mean, it started as absolutely as small as you could start, and it to now, I can't imagine, for myself anyway, taking it any further than where it's at now. So, but yeah, I mean, I had done, so I had my hand at like some home recording. It didn't catch on at that point when I was 16. I kind of like, from then it was more about dipping my toe into like other recording situations, either friends recording at home that were further along than I was, or going to smaller independent studios. And for whatever reason, none of those things made me want to do it more, like being at friends' places made me kind of like excited about like, oh, this is an attainable thing. Maybe I should get a little bit more into this. And then being at like actual or like studios, that kind of changed my perspective a little bit, because the people that were working at studios, they had more of an opinion about what I was doing than say my friends in their house. Your friend in your house will do anything you want because they're your friend and they're not making a living, and they're not like they don't think they're a producer or anything like that. They're just like, hey, cool, we're making some recording, but when you get into like a bigger studio with somebody who maybe fancies themselves somewhat of a producer, they want to tell you how they think you should do things, which sometimes is not what you're looking for, so eventually that kind of just propelled me to like, what, I think I can remove this middleman and do this myself. So lucky for me, it was right at the beginning of like Pro Tools becoming more accessible to the public, and so I got some just run-of-the-mill like Dell computer, and I got an M box with like it was, I think Pro Tools 6 had just come out, so this was like 2003, and yeah, it just kind of like that was that. So and I was in a band at the time. We'd recorded with a friend, and our drummer was also had just gotten some Pro Tools stuff, and so we were all like, "Oh, we're gonna mix this record on our own," you know. And we had started in on it, and the drummer of this band was doing the mixing, and in my opinion, it had gotten out of hand. You know, like it was everything started to feel like kind of overdone and overcooked, and it was like, you know what, I'm gonna give this a go. Like, give me this thing. I just got this Pro Tool system. I had no idea what I was doing. I didn't have good monitoring. I didn't have like any knowledge of how any of it worked. But I knew what I wanted it to sound like, and so the trial and error kind of like process began, and that was 17 years ago, and the trial and error process is still going on today.
Yeah, so
um,
not to not to turn this into too much of a therapy session, but I'm definitely sensing maybe that you have a concern with being in control. And so as an engineer, and kind of what you were talking about, you know, going to other places and feeling like you're recording, and this is like your baby, and then this fucking guy who you're paying to do this is telling you that that riff sucks, or you're not playing it right, or whatever. So
yeah,
the engineer, right? The engineer's role is variable, very variable. Like you said, if it's just your friend, they might just be sitting there like doing shit on their phone and not even paying attention to what's going
sure.
on, right? So you can be anybody. You can be the guru, you can be kind of a band member, a producer, like a parent, a child, you know, punching
Yep.
bag or whatever. So as far as you, how do you feel like, you know, what is the engineer's role in your mind, and what's like the ideal engineer? Because some control clearly is good, right? So how do you sort of draw that line?
Well, the control I wanted was for my own creation, you know. And so, and that like that want of mine uh immediately was, as soon as I started recording other people, that was my total like jumping off point, was like, I'll do anything you want. Like, I'm not precious about my name or any, you know, I mean, not that I had a name at that point, but I wasn't, it wasn't about me, it was about them. You know, like, we'll do whatever you want. You tell me what you want. I'm going to do what you want, you know, and to some degree, I'm still like that. Although now I know so much more about it, that like, I do want to educate people if I think they're making a bad choice. And if I say, hey, I think you're making a bad choice and here's why, and they say, well, we understand what you're saying and that's exactly what we want to do, then I say, fantastic. Like, as long as you know, and you know what you're doing, then like I'm with you. So yeah, it's honestly, it's less about control. It was more about less interference. You know what I mean? So yeah, and to answer your question, an engineer, it's such a wide like breadth of what's possible, especially when it like kind of morphs into a producer role, and what that even means. You know, like it can be anything from just, yeah, the person just scrolling on their phone who threw the mics in the room, or the person who's telling you that everything you're doing is wrong or whatever, and that you need to something blah blah blah. So I don't know. There's not really a right answer. You know, I've seen people benefit from both ends of the spectrum. I tend to like try to just serve the moment as best I can. You know, I still am very like hands off when it comes to like people's music. I'm pretty reluctant to say like, hey, the way you're doing that doesn't really sound good to me. If it's a sonic thing, you know, I'm like, hey, that guitar tone like is literally hurting my ears. You know, like, I think we could change something about that to make it like come across a little bit better. That's the stuff where I kind of am more hands on, you know?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, do you feel like when the band invites you to sort of be a part of the process, is that something you enjoy?
Sure. Yeah. I mean, like, you know, after being in bands for so many years, and being a musician and having some knowledge of music and songwriting, and then in production also, it's just good to be somebody who can see it from all those angles, and kind of bring that perspective. And I'm super happy to weigh in, you know, when people want more input. And it's funny enough, though, most of the time my input is like, it's fine, stop worrying, you're good, you know, like, you know, I think people want some like slave drivers sometimes, where like somebody that's going to make them do like 50 takes of a song or something like that, or like, or just be like super anal about performances. But like, I like how it sounds when it's kind of raw, and like there's some mistakes still, and like it's not overthought and overworked. So So yeah, my version of the producer is usually just letting people like just be as they are, you know.
Mhm. Would you say that that point of view has evolved or changed over time? You know, would you say that, you know, like when you started, did you feel like, say somebody messes up a fill or somebody can't get it, you know, like those things, do you feel like it's something that you kind of had to learn how to do properly as far as, yeah, that gray area between like sounds bad versus sounds raw, you know what I mean?
Uh, I don't think I've ever been super hung up on anybody's performances, you know, like especially when it's the kind of thing where, I mean, 9 times out of 10 we're pressed for time for some reason, you know, and like if they just did it 4 times exactly the same way, I'm not usually inclined to make them do it again. You know what I mean? I'm also definitely the mindset that there's probably too many bands, and like not all of them can be molded into some like perfect thing. And like I feel like if a band is bad inherently, part of my job is like letting the world know. You know what I mean? like
So
like
public service, you might say.
yeah, I mean, because like to some degree, like you could take any group of musicians and make it presentable and make it where it's like, you know, listenable or whatever to some degree. But I don't know if everybody deserves that. You know what I mean? Like I think there's too many bands. Like if you make them all sound good, how are you even going to know who's worth listening to? Um, and then there's some bands that come in and just like murder in the studio, you know, like without any assistance or anything, you know, and like it's I get a lot of credit for those recordings sounding
But
so.
just to clarify, murder is a good thing in this case.
Yeah, sorry, you know, they kill it or whatever you want to say. They do really good, and they sound amazing without any assistance, you know, even from the sonic end of it, you know, they and yeah, and those are the records that often like come back to me. It's like, damn dude, you did such a good job, and I'm like, I just recorded the band, you know, like they just played and that's what it sounded like, you know, like I kind of like maybe trim the edges a little bit, but you know, I'd love to take credit, but I kind of can't at the same time.
Okay, yeah, well, let's you know, let's segue into talking about the process itself a little bit. I think a lot of people probably are tuning in, you know, just to hear kind of your thoughts about some kind of specific aspects of recording, because I imagine a lot of people listening, you know, it's one of those things where you're always kind of learning, you know, there's always more things to try. You kind of do things one way and then you change totally, and then you go back to the first way you did it. So
all the time.
I'm going to take advantage of this format, and I'm going to have a little visual aid here. Okay. So I'm going to hold something up to the camera. Okay. And then you're going to tell me, and then you're going to tell me what it is. Are you ready?
All right. I'm ready.
Okay. Ready?
That's an SM57.
Do you want to
Was that a Unidyne one? That's a nice one.
Oh, so tell us a little bit about that. About that microphone, what it's for. Actually, you didn't even say it was a microphone. So I answered the first part of the question. It's a microphone. What does it do, and what is that one good for?
That's a dynamic microphone. It's for it's a pretty accessible one. Although I'm still amazed when people are like, oh, I didn't want to get a 57, it's too expensive. Because you know, used they're probably $60, I guess. But that's probably one of the most widely used microphones ever made. Yeah. Would you agree?
I would agree.
Isn't that the one that's on like the presidential podium and all that?
Probably, yeah. Well, it seems like there's like 40 mics on the podium, but yeah.
That's right. But it's like the official one.
Yeah. But so you're saying that it's best used to capture the president's voice?
I bet they could make a much better choice than that, but it's fine. It's low profile. The Shure SM57, it's probably one of the most, it's the most accessible, like one of the most accessible, one of the most widely used microphones around. It's probably most commonly used on snare drum and like guitar cabinet.
What about you? As far as where might you find it in your studio?
Well, so I've like many things like this microphone, there's a lineage of it. And so the one you just held up is an older American made one, right? Mm-hmm. Which sounds a little bit better than the current production ones. So I've kind of gone down the rabbit hole a little bit. So we have like several versions of those mics here. So depending on which ones, I have some where we took the transformers out of them. It's a popular modification that kind of like changes the sound a little bit. We have some vintage ones, like the predecessor to that is the 545 and 546. We have some of those, but anyway, so depending on the application, I might grab whatever variant of this. They all sound basically the same for anybody who's like worried that they've been using a regular 57. It's like probably 5% different or whatever. But yeah, I mic a snare drum pretty much every time with an old 546. I mic a guitar cabinet with a 545 basically every time. And occasionally I let if a singer wants to hold a mic, that's the mic I'll grab.
Oh, so when a singer wants to hold the mic, doing their real take, but they need to hold it for comfort and security.
Absolutely. Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, but you know what? I'm trying to think. I think that might be it, actually. I like everything else has gotten its own little buddy at this point in terms of like go-to.
Okay, are you ready for the next one?
Yes, I am.
I'm going to turn on my presentation light.
Yeah. So that's a Sennheiser 421, another microphone. Probably as widely used as the 57, maybe, or maybe the next, because it's more expensive, so it's less common to find. But I guess it's as useful and as like dynamic pun as a 57 would be. So, but that goes on every single kick drum that I mic. They're also really widely used on toms, but I don't like them on toms because they bleed way too much with cymbals and whatnot. But I think so I use a vintage 421 on bass cabinet every time. And I use the modern 421s on kick drum basically every time.
And what's the difference, just for a lay person? How is that microphone any different from a 57, or what makes
it's got a higher fidelity, basically. It's like it's got the low end, the bass, the low end is lower and the high end is higher. So it's like it's got a better response for treble and a better response for bass.
And it looks a little cooler.
It looks way cool. Although the clip's almost guaranteed to break. Mm-hmm. Everybody's has got like duct tape on it or whatever. The old ones are a lot more robust, but yeah, they sound awesome. It's one of those things, like a 57, a 421, you can almost put it on anything and it's going to sound pretty good. And it's been used. Actually, that's another thing too. The 57 or like I don't know, there's a bunch of other mics like this. They've been used so much. They've been used so frequently for so long on the same things that they're just familiar now. You know, like so many snare drums for so many decades have been recorded with the 57 that like, it's not that it's the best sounding option even, it's just it just sounds like a snare drum recording when you hear it, you know?
So you mean we've been kind of brainwashed to hear the 57 snare sound as the only correct snare sound?
Maybe so. I mean, I probably have.
Mm-hmm. Well, we can talk about that later. This might be harder to see. I don't really know. And you can just tell me, you don't have to be specific, but what type of microphone, what might you use it for?
That's a small diaphragm condenser mic. Actually, so this is a question that went unanswered for me for a really long time, is like the inherent difference between a large diaphragm and a small diaphragm and when to pick which. And there aren't a lot of good answers out there, but it turns out the small diaphragm, its off-axis bleed is much flatter and more like listenable.
Just really briefly define what off-axis bleed is.
Yeah, so like say you have something like a snare drum and you put a microphone on it and there's a hi-hat cymbal right next to that snare drum. And so when the drummer's playing, they're hitting the hi-hat and they're hitting the snare. And in that snare mic, when you listen to it, you're going to hear a bunch of the hi-hat most of the time, especially if it's like,
It's a horrible sound.
Yeah, especially if it's like a punk recording, you're going to hear tons of hi-hat in your snare mic. And so that mic is actually pretty commonly used on snare drum. And maybe part of the reason is because the bleed sounds better than, it might not be less. Well, depending on that, that's the one with the different capsules, right?
Yeah, you can do like, and it has that pad and things
right.
like that. But...
And so if you put the really, really tight pattern capsule on, it has the pickup pattern is closer to the proximity of the end of the microphone. It'll bleed less, but the bleed that you do end up getting will be more like sweet sounding, I guess. Sometimes bleed can be pretty unflattering. And there's all sorts of weird tricks that people do to minimize that.
Okay. I can sense people are drifting, so we're going to just do one more here.
This one's weird. This is the SM7. It's a broadcast microphone, but for some reason, everybody uses them on vocals now. Maybe it's because the price point. I don't know. I'm not a big fan. But
were you ever a big fan?
I used them before, and then I think at some point we shot something out against it, and it turns out that it's got a really big spike in the like presence area, like 3 kilohertz area, which is like the pain zone, you know. And so it really depends on the singer, like most microphones. But like if the singer has a voice that's even mildly piercing in that area, it's going to be really accentuated with that microphone. Also, they're really low output on that mic, so you need tons of gain on the preamp that you're using. You said we weren't going to get into too deep.
I'm sorry. Okay. One last object.
That's a reel of tape.
And why would anybody other than a religious zealot use something like this in the recording world when they can use a computer, which is good for everything?
Because that little ball of oxide, magnetized oxide, has like tons of character in it, and it imparts tons of character into what you're doing. The analogy that everybody gets is it's the same as film photos and film in the movies and stuff like that. It's a physical medium that reacts to sound or in volume and voltage or whatever you want to call it, the same way that film reacts to light. And you can the way that you push it with more sound or less or this or that, like you can affect the capture and the character that comes along with it. So the same way that film can be grainy or it can be blown out or it can be like, you know, overexposed or whatever, like, you know, tape can be distorted or it can be whatever, you know, depending on the speed you run it or the formula of tape and all that stuff. It imparts so much character in what you're doing. Whereas, you know, if you look at like a digital photo, sometimes compared to a film photo, there is no grain. The contrast might not really be flattering or like interesting. You know, there's something missing. It's not that it looks bad or it sounds bad. It just doesn't have any extra character added. So it's a big pain in the ass to use it, but to me it's well worth it. I haven't skipped a tape machine in a really long time, except for certain instances, and I usually need to be convinced.
Mm-hmm. But you didn't start off using tape. So what point did you start to kind of incorporate that into your process?
About 10 years ago. So I went a good little while without tape. And I learned everything when I first started, everything was digital, 100% basically. Like after the preamps, everything was digital. And I gravitated more toward analog every step of the way. It's kind of just my vibe. I don't know. And even like I went as far as like when I learned how the analog process kind of works, it was way before I was ever going to be able to afford the setup that I wanted and any of that stuff. But I started conditioning myself as early as possible to be able to record analog properly. So like, and not to get too deep into this, but like because tape has an audible noise floor, it has hiss, right? And digital does not. So when you record something to digital, you can just kind of throw a mic up and record it. And you know, as long as the mic's kind of in the right spot, you can do a lot to it later with very little consequences. With tape, you can't really do that. So like, you know, if you're going to equalize something or compress something, most of the time, especially if you're going to do it a lot, the amount of noise and hiss and all that stuff that you're going to get if you do it after it's been recorded to tape is going to be prohibitive. So I was kind of, you know, I was told early on, like, oh, when you record analog, you have to do your processing on the front end on the way in as you're recording, which is really daunting to somebody who's only working in a computer with no consequences, where you're like, oh, I just record it and then I'll figure out the EQ later. I'll figure out the compression later, you know? And so as early as I could, I started setting up my Pro Tools sessions essentially like a split console, where I would set up a bunch of channel strips, digital channel strips with EQ and compression, and then they would dump to recording channels, so that I could do analog processing, learn the flow and like get it right, so that as soon as I was able to do it for real, I could jump into it. So anyway, yeah, I wanted to do it from the get-go, but I needed to like prep myself for it.
Mm-hmm. Well, yeah, sounds like the conditioning and training, it does remind me a little bit of, yeah, a religious fanatic, which is maybe what it takes to really be dedicated to tape. So I really do want to leave some time for Q&A. So I'm going to try to ask another smaller picture question, and then we'll ask a couple of bigger picture questions, and then we'll open it up. So as far as digital and analog goes, what you're saying about grain, all those things are interesting, particularly as plugins get more and more advanced and the digital world is able to mimic things and make us pretty much not able, your average sort of person can't really tell sometimes for even photos or whatever. This includes the creation of algorithms that mimic a particular producer's style of mixing stuff, so you have a plugin where you don't even know what's going on. You just turn it on or whatever, and you kind of use it. Yeah. Now, you thought I was going to take that somewhere bad, but really what I would like to ask is if they were able to upload you into the mainframe, right? What are some things that that algorithm kind of would include? What are some things that you feel like are characteristic of your sound, which I know is hard because you are yourself, but reflect on that for a minute. If you do feel like there's a sound and a particular quality to the things that you do, what are some aspects of it?
I mean, my knee-jerk answer is that there wouldn't be anything super special about a bunch of plugins with my name on them. You know what I mean? I tend to use a lot of traditional equipment, and I use it in fairly traditional ways. But one thing I do really like is saturation. I do it pretty much at every step of the way. So I suppose that could be baked into anything. But yeah, that's one thing that I've kind of like, I find myself every step of the way.
Saturation, yeah. Maybe explain what that means in music. I think in visual stuff, people maybe know it's when you make the colors brighter and everything gets more intense. In recording, what do you mean by saturation?
Well, so basically every step of the way, on from the microphone goes into an amplifier, like a guitar would go into an amplifier, and that amplifier can be can have a lot of color to it. You can overdrive it depending on it could be a tube amplifier, it could be whatever. The tape has its own attributes where you can so it's basically like, if overloading things is essentially the easiest way to put it, but like overloading amplifiers, overloading tape, it can be done subtly, it can be done not subtle, but it imparts a lot of character, and it makes things feel more exciting and more like the same way that you'd like blow out a photo or something like that. It's like it adds a lot of like wow. It can make things like drums sound thicker and more aggressive. It can make vocals sound more like intense or whatever. It kind of depends on the setting. But this is stuff that we've heard on our favorite recordings going all the way back to when recordings first started, because when they first started, they were swimming in distortion and saturation. And saturation is kind of an odd word to use, I suppose, but like saturation is like the magic point between like compression and distortion, basically, where it's like if you take compression too far, it becomes distortion essentially, and then the sweet spot in between is saturation.
If somebody is trying to take that idea and use it sort of in their home studio, maybe just summarize, are you saying like, don't be afraid to sort of turn the thing up, even if it says that it's clipping, as long as it sounds good, you're good?
Well, let's be clear, right? So like, we've had a lot of discussions about this lately. There's like analog equipment in particular, even the cheapest 4-track, right? There's some pleasing and flattering types ways to like abuse the equipment. Digital has now made plugins that emulate those things really well, and they're doing an amazing job at it. But it doesn't mean you just can like clip your converters and like now you've got cool whatever. Like just the same way that pixelation is like the not cool form of lo-fi digital. You know, digital clipping is, I mean, it's not quite as flattering and like in alluring as analog is. So we talked about like things like I don't know, like black metal audio and visuals, you know, where like they were made possible to like this really interesting lo-fi character that would come with like a recording that was just done kind of like poorly, but done in really like simple means, but analog. Same way that you would take like a Xerox copy of something over and over and over again, and like it makes some cool grainy what have you. But like when you do like culty art like in Photoshop and don't know what you're doing, it's just pixelated you know, JPEGs, and like that's not cool.
Yeah, I mean, I would say that to our ears that maybe grew up with less of that, you know, yeah, it's jarring. But yeah, maybe to people who you know, grow up and that's all around them, maybe their relationship to digital clipping will be different, you know. And
maybe so. Well, I will say it's all extremely possible at home. But a lot of times all people have is a preamp and then a converter, and converter clipping is like the least I don't know, musical, I guess, of all. Like, but fine, you can either capture clean and destroy with software, or find a cool way to like fuck your shit up on the way in, you know?
Yeah. Okay, last question before we open it up. So bigger picture here. This has a lot of elements, so maybe pick what you like. But you know, you are someone who, you know, we've kind of been talking about recording stuff only, but as a musician and in general, your background is definitely comes from more of a DIY sort of world. And how do you feel like you carry that ethic with you today, even in like a really big kind of, you know, pretty, I would say, you know, like a fancy studio, you know, as far as like compared to say a home studio, you know, how do you feel that informing what you do? And in particular, as far as like what role you're playing, you know, shaping the face of kind of what music is going to look like. You know, I mean, here, like we're two white guys talking about recording, you know, this is the first time this has ever happened. So, but you know, what's your role kind of, because DIY is a, you know, ultimately an ethical sort of standpoint, you know, so
Sure.
How do you kind of carry that into your, into what you do as an engineer?
I mean, I don't know, throughout all the years of doing it or whatever, like I think that DIY spirit is kind of like just stuck with me. Like there's still a goal to make everything feel like organic and real. You know what I mean? Like I'm still recording. I record bands the same way today as I did when I was in my parents' house. You know, like just kind of throw everybody in the room and record. You know, like sometimes we get fancier than that, but a lot of times it's that simple. You know, so yeah, I've from the DIY side of things, I try, you know, over the years, I've tried to keep it very affordable as well and very accessible to people, and flexible in that, you know, I've had people say like, we want to come record a record, but we can only afford one day. And we want to do like a full record. And the answer, instead of like, well, sorry, is like, well, I guess we just have to figure out how to do it in one day, you know, like, and we have done it multiple times. So like, yeah, just kind of not being like overly conventional with the way things are done, or not forcing, you know, letting an artist come in and be who they are, you know, as they come. I don't know. I think that stuff's important. Instead of like, yeah, I don't know, playing it like you're at a studio now and this is how we do things, you know, like, yeah, I try to keep it serving the people, if that makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Okay, well, let's open it up a little bit. As far as the chat goes, we have one question that it's a little, to me, I'm guessing this might be the name of a song, or it might be something about Pro Tools. Link says RC20 on the master.
RC20 on the master. I don't know what RC20 is. Can somebody elaborate?
Link, you can elaborate, and you can even unmute yourself if you like, or you can put it in the chat.
Sorry, that was a bit of a joke. RC20 is like a really popular saturation lo-fi plugin right now that every user online is using.
All good. I will comment on that, because I did have a saturator on my master for way too many years, and I in quarantine I went on a deep dive to like kind of rework my mastering in my like final mixing process, and I'm sad to say I had to take the saturator off my master. So but yeah, try it. It gets out of hand kind of quick.
I do have a serious question, and that is, I've been listening to No Dream a lot this year. It's probably one of my albums of the year, and
Awesome.
listening to it a lot in comparison to like a lot of Jeff's older work and whatnot. It's just a lot more clean, I guess is the word I would say. It's a lot more, I don't know if you would call it high fidelity or whatever, but just everything's separated like really nice, and everything just sounds extremely well recorded. So if there's like I guess if there's a difference between, for example, the No Dream recording process versus, for example, maybe some of the older albums, would you like to elaborate on that a little bit?
Sure. Yeah.
Thank you, Link. Great question.
Yeah. Jeff Rosenstock is one of my favorite people to work with. We've done like 10 records together at this point. A handful of his, but then I've also engineered while he's produced other people, and it's like it's amazing watching him work, whether it's on his own record or on somebody else's. But I mean, the shortest answer to your question is we all get better at what we're doing every time. So the process this time around was not terribly different than before. When we do Jeff's records, they typically record live all in the same room with amps really loud and just like going for it. This is the first time we've recorded at this new studio. And everything about the new studio is like, is better than the old one, basically. And so, yeah. Oh, also, this is the first record that Jeff and I have mixed together. So Jeff's been, Jeff is an engineer himself, and he does a lot of, he does a lot of demoing. He does a lot of, he's recorded for the people, but I don't think he does so much anymore. And he scores music for Craig of the Creek, the comedy or the Cartoon Network show. And like that stuff he does, he writes, records, mixes, and masters all that stuff at his house. So like, he knows what he's doing. Also, I will say this. When Jeff Rosenstock delivers like demos of a record, it's the entire record is already completely been recorded, like at his house. Like it's programmed drums, but everything else is like already there. So anyway, so he understands the process and he knows what he's doing. And he, just like everybody, we all get better at what we're doing. So this time I think we just like had a clear idea what we wanted. We did sit down at the console and we actually mixed it together. Oh, it was the most analog mix too of any of the records that of Jeff's records. So we actually like, we had hands on the console. We were doing like, manual automation. We used all like outboard effects and processing and stuff like that. So yeah, it's like every one of those things that I just said has like a little bit of influence on all of it,
Just to clarify, Jack, you're saying you mixed it analog?
Yeah, well, we mixed it like from Pro Tools, but we mixed it on the console in the room using like, instead of, where we normally use a plugin, we used a piece of hardware. And yes, yeah, we did mix it analog. It was digitally edited and kind of like, we do kind of a hybrid thing where we track to 2-inch tape until we run out of tracks, and then we put it all into Pro Tools, and then we finish tracking, and then from there we this time around we mixed it pretty much fully analog.
Cool. All right. So yeah, I'm going to keep rolling with the questions. Thanks, Link. So anybody, just feel free to drop your Q&A or your question in the chat, or raise your hand. We'll try to check the participants thing, and if you want to ask your question like a speaking human being. So Manny says, I have a 2-part question. What's been your process and tricks for recording and mixing shoegaze? And what was it like recording with Whir?
Uh, the Shoegaze thing, the first time I recorded they were probably the first band of that style that I worked with, I guess, if I remember right. And they had a pretty good idea of what they wanted, and so I just kind of did what they told me. So when you listen to like Distressor, it's basically just them going like, yeah, well, and then just like, actually, I remember it well now. Now I'm thinking about it. They came in, they recorded this music. It sounded cool. They recorded these like two-part, male female vocal. It sounded really good. It was like an indie rock record. And then like we got to the mixing, and they're like, yeah, so now make it so that you can't hear the vocals at all, and just put a ton of reverb on them. And like those were the actual words that were said, and I was like, huh, okay. And that's what we did. And then obviously from there, I think we did like 5 records together or something like that. And so I became more, and at the same time, like Death Heaven's all happening, and like, yeah. And so now I've done that style a bunch, but yeah, I mean, I don't know. I did some pretty stupid shit early on. They're like, oh, the vocals should sound like super far away, and so like my tendency is always to like, well, just put it far away from the microphone then, so like I remember we did some vocals for Whir Records where we had the 2 singers at the same time singing in a medium-sized room, and just had the microphones like 10 feet away from them, like they were here like facing out in 2 different directions, and but in Shoegaze, as you know, it's just reverb on pretty much everything. But it turns out that if you put everybody super far away, it also sounds far away. So some of those records are done like that. Yeah, I don't know. It turns out Shoegaze stuff, they don't like room mics so much. They don't like room mics on drums. They don't really like them on other stuff either. They just want reverb on everything, which is fun. But it takes a bit of I don't know, conditioning to get used to that.
Financial planning when starting a studio.
Yeah.
This is Evan's question.
Financial planning when starting a studio.
Or anything, buying a car, financial planning.
Yeah, right. I mean, my plan from the start has always been to keep the overhead as low as possible and as manageable as possible. So like, when I was working on my parents' house, I was paying rent there, and there was a weird like juggling point where I was kind of like, well, I think I can quit my job and do this, but I don't know if I want to make enough money to pay the rent. And I remember asking like, hey, is it cool if I like, I might not be able to make rent like next month, like, is that cool? And they were like, nah. And so I was like, well, shit, I guess we're gonna give it a go. So and that overhead was pretty low back then. But like, even when I finished school and I moved out, and we got this this very DIY warehouse space and built a studio inside of it. It was a bunch of friends who didn't know what they're doing. We built a studio for like, I think the whole budget for the whole build out. And this is like almost 1,000 square foot studio with 4 rooms and like windows and the whole thing. Like none of us knew what we were doing. The whole budget was like $10,000 for like all the material, the entire build out, like a whole freestanding fucking recording studio. There was not one professional ever stepped foot in it during the build of this thing. It wasn't soundproofed. It wasn't acoustically tuned. It turns out, by the way, that's part of why it sounded the way it did. Anyway, I'll add to this. I've always lived where the studio is. Like even where we're sitting right now, we're in this really big, nice professional studio, and right above here, like back that way, another couple feet is my apartment. So like, it's been a necessity for me to live where the studio is, because I wouldn't be able to afford to have a living space and have a studio space. So also I just kind of learned early on that home studios have a little bit of a stigma of being kind of lesser than, because homes aren't built to be recording studios most of the time, especially like small suburban homes. And so instead of having a home studio, I just lived at where a recording studio is.
Home.
Yeah, exactly. And so, but yeah, so I built this studio for a fairly reasonable amount of money. And then living at the space where the studio was and sharing the space with a bunch of other people. It was like a very like punk house situation where like you'd walk out of the studio and you're in a kitchen, but it's like, that's my kitchen where I live. And I have 2 other roommates, and like there's a screen printing operation in the front and all this stuff. But I think for the first like 10 years or whatever it was that I was there, my live and work rent combined was like less than $1,000, you know? So like, it was the kind of thing where I could, you know, I could afford to do this thing. Even if I wasn't making any money doing it, I could get a part-time job someplace doing something else and still have this recording studio and be able to record whenever I wanted to, and like, and all this stuff. So like, I would say keeping the overhead realistic and low and adapting to whatever situation is good. Also being plugged into some kind of industry situation obviously is very helpful. If you have a job at like a music store or something, you can get stuff for a discount. That's great because you're gonna be buying a ton of shit. So you might as well not pay full price. I was lucky enough to have a very, very good friend who works in the audio industry. And so a lot of, you know, there's friends and family discounts and all that stuff. So like my early days, I was extremely lucky to get kind of like a head start on that stuff.
So you said no professional stepped foot in that studio, but at least one professional stepped out of that studio. Okay, so Adam has a little bit of a different kind of question. This question might be pointed, I'm not sure. But Adam asks, favorite memory or show in Reno that you have played?
Oh man, that's super easy.
Nice.
We played Reno a lot, and we often played Fort Ryland.
Also, for anyone who doesn't know, when you say we, you're referring to?
Oh, Comadre. I was in a band for almost 10 years called Comadre. It was kind of like a punk band. And but my most memorable Reno show, hands down, would have been I don't know what month. It was probably June of like 2006, I would say. 2005, I'll say. But so Comadre played a show outside of Salt Lake City, and it was kind of shitty. And then we drove overnight, you know, to Reno because that was the last show of our first US tour. And we were all excited to get there because somebody had some friends at the house or whatever it was. And so we like drag our asses in and fall asleep on this floor. And then we wake up in the morning and there's another band on the floor next to us. And it turns out this band, Graf Orlock from Los Angeles, had also played a shitty show just outside of Salt Lake City. And their last show of their first US tour was also at Fort Ryland the next day. So they drove overnight and like crashed on this floor with us. And so we both woke up in the morning to these strangers and had the day free before our show. And so we like went out and like swam in the river and, you know, and just kind of like broed down for the day. And like I'd never heard their band. They'd never heard our band, you know, like we didn't really know what was waiting for us at the end of the day, but we were like being friendly. And then we both impressed each other really super hard with our bands at the end of the night. And it was, yeah. And it was, we made some lifelong friends for sure. Even today, actually, I was just coaching Justin from Graf Orlock on his Pro Tools setup that I just like helped him install a few months ago. He's now like learning how to record himself. And so I'm his 24-hour tech support.
That's awesome.
So yeah, best Reno show for sure.
That's because Reno's a magical place.
Yeah, and all those, I mean, like Jeff and Susie and Rox and all those people that were there early on, Joe, Reno, and all like that. Those are like amazing folks.
Okay, so it's 8 o'clock. Jack, are you okay to just field a couple more here?
I have nowhere to go.
Okay.
Nothing to do.
We have just a shout out here. Great show and memories. What up, Jack, says Austin Pratt. So Skate P says your signature style can be detected in the projects you've done with larger bands like Jeff Rosenstock and Joyce Manor. But then there are other projects that have flown under people's radars, like the remaster of the Blowout album. How do you decide which projects to work on?
That's easy. I don't say no to anybody. That's another thing to I guess to consider when you're gonna do this stuff for a living. There's this inherent fear that's just always looming over your head that like business is gonna dry up at any time. So you don't say no to anything. I've only recently said no to a couple things because people their process was so opposite mine that I was kind of like, I don't think I'm your guy, you know, like your process sounds like torture to me. So like, I don't think I'm gonna have a good time doing it. And it's probably not gonna make the best result. So yeah, so I don't know if somebody wants to work with me, that's all it takes for like, you know, 99% of the time.
What just because I'm sure everyone's curious, what can you be a bit more specific about the torture?
Sure. So my torture looks like a band who's a perfectly capable band of playing together all at one time, but they want to record everything one thing at a time. And not only that, they want to do it with a click track. They want to do it without tape because then things can be recorded onto a grid properly. Then things are time corrected. Then, you know, one at a time, we start layering bass and guitar and whatever. And in my opinion, that process really sucks the life out of the final product. And so, like, not only does it take forever, not only is it a big pain in the ass, but it's also taking us in the opposite direction of where I would like it to go, which is like an organic, visceral, like energetic, you know, type of a situation. So yeah, that's my like worst nightmare.
You don't have to reveal any industry secrets, but are there bands that you feel like do that you feel like shouldn't do that? Like, do you think that there's a sense maybe that people sometimes do that because they feel like that's the way things have to be done, or they want to, you know, they feel like to stay on time, they just got to do that? You know, is it, do you think it's a personal choice, or do you feel like there's something floating around that people think that that's like the right thing to do?
There's definitely a thought process of like, you know, if you're going to make a record in a real studio in like the real way, that there's a certain way you have to do it. And that's absolutely not true. I couldn't tell you what bands do what other than the ones that recorded me. You know what I mean? I don't really like, there's tons of bands abusing that whole process that I would just described, but I couldn't tell you one of them. I could guess, I guess, but like, you know, like it's like hyper production. It's like pop production essentially, but to a genre of music that's supposed to be, you know, raw and energetic. You know, it's like there's nothing raw and energetic about you know, you're basically like programmed drums, you know. So yeah, but I will say this: a conversation I have very often on the phone, or like not as much lately. People, I don't know, people, because of people like Jeff Rosenstock and whatever, like I've got a bunch of like-minded people coming, so you don't need to weed people out as much anymore. But I would get bands calling and they would say like, hey, we like your records. We want to make a record with you. And I say, awesome. You know, what's that usually look like for you? And they say like, what? And then they describe what I just told you. And I say, okay, well, I tend to not do that. I don't really believe in that approach. And here's why. And maybe that's the reason that some of the records that I've worked on you like is because they weren't done that way. You know, they were just a bunch of people recording in a room without a click track and without like worrying so much. And people often would be like, whoa, that's crazy, man. You're blowing my mind. Like, and it's like, yeah, it's okay. Like, you're a band, just play, you know, you should be able to just play. So anyway, and that's not to say like never use a click track or something like that. I mean, like if that's the way it goes for you, then that's the way it goes. But if you gave me a choice, I would always just throw the band in and let them play.
Okay, Watson asks, how do you go about staging the saturation throughout the mix? Maybe thinking that, yeah, if you saturate everything by the end of the day, you're going to have a big mess. So how do you keep that under control?
Well, let's see. I'm looking around the room at the gear to think about this. So like, okay, so like I've gone through tons and tons of gear, trying things out. Like when you only work by yourself, you only can try what you have, right? So like you end up buying a lot of stuff and selling a lot of stuff and like trying to find the same way that like a guitar player like needs to try out, you know, different guitars and amps and strings and pickups and speakers and all that stuff. Like that times a million is a recording studio. So, but I will say at this stage, I found this like very well balanced situation where I've chosen gear that like very much caters to my taste. So anyway, but to give you an idea, right? So you go microphone into like a preamp, right? I chose preamps that you can drive really hard and they don't fall apart. And that was just, I don't know, it's part of my thing. So I use an API console because the way API saturates to me is really pleasing, and it's really it's hard to overdo it Yeah. Whereas some things do fall apart very quickly. Anyway, from there you could go to like compressors, tape. But I guess the main two places that I saturate are the preamps and the tape machine. And then when I'm mixing, there might be some final stage type compression, and like I also mix to tape, so like I use that in a way. But that being said, there's little stages of saturation that can be done anywhere, and it's kind of like a to taste, per record kind of thing.
So I'm going to piggyback off that question just a little bit before I ask the last question in the chat here. How do you navigate the fine line between becoming like a crap hound hoarder with gear and actually having like a functional studio? And what, clearly after years, you pare things down, but yeah, how do you what's your relationship to the gear?
I mean, I have a lot of stuff, but I will say that if things don't get used for a little bit, they go. So like that's my test basically, is like because of tracking analog, you use a lot of stuff on the front end, so like equalizers and compressors and whatever like that are being utilized for the capture of the recording. So I've kind of like gathered up a bunch of stuff that's really good for all the given things that I like to use them for. And yeah, if something goes a couple months without getting used, it's like, well, I guess I don't like that anymore. I guess that goes. So I've kept it pretty lean, even though there's a lot of stuff. It gets used on a daily basis. Okay,
so we have a broader music questions. Favorite albums of the year, or maybe what albums do you think were best mixed this year?
That's hard. I don't listen to very much stuff. But
well, I want to piggyback to it, and just kind of add to that. Do you find when you listen to other things that you like, do you first hear them as a technical product, or do you feel like you still have the ability to just listen to music?
I definitely have the ability to still listen to music, but I find that the music that I like a lot tends to have really good production. Like I like Tom Waits, like Tom Waits recordings are amazing. So like, yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to think like, or, I don't know, like that Refused record is probably one of my all-time favorite hardcore records. And like, I was obsessed for years with the production of that record. Like it was like, obviously
The Shape of Punk to Come.
Yeah. And so, yeah, I don't know. I find they often go hand in hand. I mean, like I guess I've liked plenty of stuff that like is recorded kind of badly or whatever, but I'm trying to think of what that might have been. Anyway, but I don't hear a lot of new music because I work on a lot of music. So like a lot of like I end up listening to mostly what I'm working on, but I do get people feeding me stuff occasionally for like for references for something that we might be shooting for. And so thankfully the people that I work with do listen to a lot of music, and they can kind of like hand me some stuff. So one of the better sounding recordings that I've heard this year is that new Idols record. It's pretty gnarly. I just kind of was exposed to that band recently, and I was pretty impressed right off the bat, especially that first song on their new record. It's like, it just hits really, really hard. And it made me go like, oh shit, I'm gonna download this song and have it in the rotation for the references file. References, by the way, very important when you're making records.
Do you find yourself trying to reverse engineer what people did?
Yeah, I mean, you can only do so much by listening. You can only guess your way so far by listening. But yeah, of course. I mean, I've done that for years and years with stuff like I was talking about that Refused record. I mean, I've gotten like stupidly deep on the Refused record because like there's very little documentation or like any information about what they did, like very, very little, because it was 1998 and like I don't know. I guess maybe they broke up before the deep dive came. But I've taken just like sections where it's just the drums, because the drums sound so good on that record, and just loop them for a really long time and listen to them, and like listen to just the left side and listen to just the right side and like listen to the subs, try to figure out how they're mic'd. And I thought I did. I mic'd a lot of records based on how I thought that one was done. And so I might be wrong, but it's the same as like people who look at, artists who saw like the dollar bill early on and thought that it was like illustrations. And so they learned how to illustrate like that. And then only to find out later that it was like, you know, woodcuts or whatever, like it was prints, you know, but like, but those people became amazing illustrators as a result. So it's like, so there's some good things to be found in there, in that weird pursuit of like trying to reverse engineer.
Yeah, and that's a good note to close on. So before I ask the final question, just want to thank everyone so much for hanging out with us. Thank you, Jack. Once again, you know, this is, you know, these times are tough or whatever, everyone's heard it, but it's really great to see people and just be able to chat. And we really appreciate your time, Jack. And, you know, hopefully we'll, you know, be seeing each other at some point.
Yeah.
Just a reminder, I'm just going to pop the Holland link in there just one more time. You know, if people want to support Holland and kind of help us out with the stuff that we do and things like this, there's a link in the chat. Final question for you, Jack. As far as that goes, you know, you're kind of talking about the artistic element to recording, right? So even though this whole time you've been talking about kind of doing things naturally, just sort of like setting things up and kind of letting the band take over, but obviously there is kind of a creative side to it, and you know, listening to recordings you love, whether or not they intended to do it, you know, it came out a certain way, and as you
Sure.
interpret it and you try to maybe mimic it or try to get inspiration from it, it comes out, you know, it's kind of then refracted through your brain and comes out a different way. And it really is, you know, a creative process. And even though there's a lot of accidents, there's a lot of stuff that people thought a lot about. Maybe the accidents is they wanted it to sound one way, it sounded totally different, but that different way was also really awesome. So maybe just, you know, leave us here with kind of what's your favorite kind of part about recording, what, you know, aside from it being your job, you know, and, you know, like the thing that you obviously do now kind of for your life, what's the thing about it that you still, you know, that you still really love? Like kind of what keeps you invested in it? What are you still passionate about? And for anyone listening here, you know, what do you think it should inspire kind of an engineer?
I mean, shit. That's gonna be different for everybody, obviously. And like, I could name you 100 things that like I love doing this so much, and like, and it's you know, I joke that I'm gonna die slumped over the console, you know, of old age, because that's just how it's gonna go. Like, why retire when you have something that you love to do so much? But I mean, I love helping musicians like realize their vision. Like when people hear something back and they're just like, oh my God, that's the sound I've been hearing in my head, you know, or whatever. Like it's an amazing thing to be able to like, to be the vehicle that like helps somebody get to the place they're trying to go, you know. From a technical standpoint, it's also this thing that like you never get good enough at it to satisfy yourself. And but the incremental improvements that you chip away at are enough to keep you so engaged. You know, I mean, today I was sitting here kind of like scratching my head about some shit and kind of like, you know, searching for this sound or whatever, you know, like it's a never ending pursuit. And so I don't know, that's kept me interested this far, you know. And so I'm yeah, it's all, but everything about it, it's super gratifying. Even just the bands that I've come, like the friendships that I've made as a result, like the music that I've been able to be a part of, that's like some of my favorite records ever, and like favorite people ever, you know, and being like an inherent part of the process. It's so rewarding. I mean, I don't know, it's yeah, I can't point to one thing and be like, this is what I like, but yeah, I like everything.
Do you like talking about it?
Sure. I did like a faux TED Talk thing, like to Justin Smith the other day, because he was like, he's learning about mixing and like how stuff works, you know? And so I did a screen share with him where I like walked him through this mix and how I did it and stuff. And yeah, it's fun. I mean, it's like, just like anything, it helps you understand it more, especially when you get into the technical side. Like, it's fun to talk about what we're talking about, of course, but when you're like teaching somebody why you're doing things and all that stuff, it starts to kind of like, it all gets clearer to you, and like, and you understand it better. And like, I don't know, I mean, it's what I'm thinking about all day anyway. So talking about it with people that are excited about it is, it's great.
Well, and thank you so much, Jack, for talking to us about it today. Kyle 427J says, warm greetings from Antarctica to our comrades in the belly of the beast.
Whoa.
Thanks again. Watson says, we'll be very stoked to watch a mix through. If anyone has any parting comments to Jack here, we look forward to hearing more recordings of yours soon, Jack, and we really appreciate taking the time.
Thank you guys for having me.
Okay, Brigden, should we wrap it?
I think so.
All right, thanks everyone. Have a great night. And this video will be available later to watch as many times as you like. Memorize sections, write about it, whatever you like to do. So
Hi,
yeah.
Shannon and Evan.
Thanks, guys.
Hi.
Hi, guys.
Yeah, if anyone just wants to say hey too, I mean, we can just keep this thing open for a minute.
Hi, everybody. We're gonna.
Also, hi, Brigden.
Hello. Oh, hello. Oh, hello. I was wondering.
Yeah,
It's good to see you, Evan.
nice to see you too. Here, bye, Jack.
Bye.
Bye, guys.
All right, Jackson, someday we'll see you in Reno again, hopefully.
I'll be back. If we can get Dangerous to play a show again, we'll go to Reno.
Yeah, we're booking for 2025 right now, so we'll talk.
Oh my God.